Welcome everyone to the INC Transportation Committee meeting for July 14th, 2022. We have a full agenda today, and these are all topics that are really timely here in Denver. We're going to start off with an update on the Denver Moves Everyone 2050 effort. That's to organize our future investments to implement all of our multimodal transportation plans. So we're getting kind of a midterm, midway through update on that from Taylor Phillips. Next, we'll have an update on the Micromobility program from Stephen Rijo. That will include both, I believe, the Micromobility shuttle vans filling in where traditional bus service has gaps, as well as the bikes share and scooters share. So they recently made a change to how that's done a couple of years ago, and we'll see how it's coming along and if it's living up to all the promises. Next, the future of shared streets. This is going to be a really early look at a project that's just kicking off for taking what we learned during the pandemic about shared streets and coming up with what we want to continue over time as a permanent part of our repertoire. And then finally, Freedom to Walk. Alan Cowgill and Jacob Smith will be presenting on something they're working on well, I'll let them talk about it, but basically, I think it has its core in equity of enforcement. So we'll start tonight with Denver Moves Everyone 2050. Taylor Phillips, we've made you a co-host, so I will stop sharing, and you can share your materials. Hello, everyone.
Hi, guys. Thank you so much for having me tonight. Let me figure out how to share here. I think we want me. Okay. All right. Can you see my slides?
Looks perfect. Thank you.
Full screen. All right. Cool. Well, thank you all so much for being here tonight. My name is Taylor Phillips. I am a city planner at DOTI. I've been working on Denver Moves Everyone, which is Denver's transportation plan. Sam Piper is the project manager for this project. He is out of town on PTO, having a blast somewhere. So you get me tonight. So thanks for having me again. So a quick overview of what I will go over tonight. First, I'll give you kind of a brief overview of what is Denver Moves Everyone, what have we been doing? And then next, I'll kind of dive into the phase that we're in right now, which is prioritizing our transportation future. And then we'll hold some time for Q&A at the end. So let's kick it off here. So why are we completing a strategic transportation plan now? So the last time we actually did this was in 2008. Since then, we've become the 5th fastest growing city in the US, with 24% more folks who live here than they did in 2008. So we've got some work to do to keep up with the demand that this growing population has placed on our transportation system. Our partner departments have their own strategic plans. Parks has game plan, CPD has Blueprint Denver, and our infrastructure side has One Water. DOTI, on the other hand, has Denver Moves Bikes, Denver Moves Pheasant Trails, Denver Moves Transit, and Vision Zero plans. So all of these plans will now be able to be unified under one strategic transportation plan. So by unifying all of these previous planning efforts between our modal and Vision Zero plans and all of the area and corridor plans we've created over the past 10 to 20 plus years, we'll be able to program projects for complete streets and think more holistically about how our transportation networks and how they intertwine. So we're about 3/4 of the way through the project, hoping to wrap up later this winter. So in our first phase, we did a deep dive into where we are as a transportation agency now, and we crafted our state of the system report, which I'll talk about in a moment. We also identified community values, which formed our goals. In phase 2, we conducted some outreach and analysis around modeling different future scenarios. So we asked things like, what would it look like if our transportation system became really technology driven? What about if it became really walkable and green? What if we just kept doing what we're doing now and don't change anything? So right now we're working on figuring out how to prioritize and program our funding wisely and what objectives and goals we should strive for. Our next and final step will be identifying those metrics and indicators against which we'll measure success and wrap all this information into a planning document that's easy for folks to use. There we go. So I'm going to dive into the state of the system report, which is kind of our existing conditions and guiding document for the project. So the state of the system report includes a few important details. First, we present Denver's transportation vision and goals. We provide information on the historical events that have shaped Denver's transportation system as we know it today, and some of the inequities that many Denverites face in getting around. And we use some new data and cool analysis tools that show us where we have gaps and needs in our system. We spend a ton of time and effort engaging not only our city partners, but also the public in developing our vision and goals. Some of my favorite stats here are that we engaged over 1,000 people who have never engaged in city planning processes before, and we reached all 78 Denver neighborhoods just in our first phase of engagement. So we as a project team feel pretty good about our vision and goals and that they really reflect the needs and the desires of our community. So I'm going to just read off the screen here our DME vision. So Denver moves everyone and everything with respect and care. Denver is a city of safe streets connected by sustainable mobility options, providing equitable access and opportunity for the people who need it most. So that's our DME vision, and then our goals are mobility, safety, sustainability, community, and quality. And you'll see here too that equity is the kind of common thread that ties all of these goals together. It's kind of our overarching goal that we need to think about and within all these other goals. So let's dive into what we learned from the data. So one of the things we learned is that Denver's density is increasing rapidly. Coordinating development, land use, and transportation investments is going to be necessary so that we can encourage multimodal trips and healthy neighborhoods while mitigating against displacement and gentrification. We also realize that we're not really moving the needle when it comes to mode shift. If our population continues to grow and the percentages of folks who drive alone to work stay the same, we'll not only see gridlock on our streets, but also the effects of the huge number of cars on our roadways, including some of the poor air quality we already see and climate change. So when we dove deeper into the commute data, we found that there's a disproportionate burden that our low income and communities of color face when traveling. For example, low income and BIPOC, that's Black, Indigenous, and people of color individuals tend to take transit at much higher rates than higher income and white individuals. And transit trips take 2.6 times longer than driving. We also found that vehicle miles traveled on our roadways has increased 15%, which has a huge impact on air quality and the health of Denverites. So as a result of the increased emissions from vehicles on our roadways, we're also seeing the number of extreme weather events increasing dramatically. Before the year 2000, we rarely saw days with temperatures over 100 degrees. That's becoming more and more common in recent years, as you may have noticed. So this increase in VMT, vehicle miles traveled, also corresponds with higher rates of traffic deaths and serious injuries on our streets. All this data and information clearly points us to the need to improve options for people who travel on our roadways. We need to do better at educating the public about ways to get around without a car, as well as build out more cohesive and reliable biking, walking, and transit networks. I can pause here. Joel, I don't know if you want to pause for some questions about the state of the system before I move on, or if what your preference is there.
I think we should keep going and we'll do questions at the end.
Okay.
We're about 12 minutes in and this whole segment, including Q&A, has 30 minutes. So
Okay.
I'm just keeping that time in mind. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Joel. I just wanted to double check or I just charged along. Cool. So we just wrapped up our third phase of outreach and engagement, which asked people about priorities and trade-offs. We're still crunching the numbers on our survey results, and that'll probably be done in the next week or two. So unfortunately, I don't have those to share with you all today, but I'm going to give a quick overview of the questions we asked and how what we learned from the survey is going to influence project scoring and prioritization. So one of the big outcomes of this project is going to be a 6-year CIP or capital improvement plan, where we're going to identify which projects and programs we should fund over the next 6 years, and then over the next 7 to 15, and then beyond. So the online survey consisted of 2 main questions related to priorities and trade-offs. So these are the tough decisions that we make as city planners every day. Each question began with kind of an education component about how we spend money today, followed by a question. So first, we gave folks an overview of where transportation funding comes from and what it's spent on. So from this chart here, we can see that we get funding from property taxes, sales taxes, grants, and voter approved bonds. And that most folks in Denver actually contribute about $16 per month to transportation. So this is how we currently split up transportation funding. We have kind of 3 main buckets. So 25% of our funds is kind of split towards what we call, or between what we call improving and expanding our transportation system. So that's like improving is making narrow sidewalks and bike lanes wider, building new transit lanes, and then expanding is building new infrastructure. So new transit lanes, new bike lanes, new roadways, things like that. So the remaining 75% is split 50-50 between maintaining and operating our system. So operating is keeping the technology and the staff that make our transportation system work. And then maintaining is things like fixing potholes, fixing signals, fixing street lights, things like of that nature. So knowing those 4 buckets of funding, we then asked folks if they were given $100 to invest, how would you split up the money? So it was kind of a fun budgetary, if you were mayor for the day or city manager for the day, how would you split up our money? So we're going to take all the feedback that we got from this question to kind of rethink those buckets and how much we should spend in each in the future. So we have a limited amount of funding, obviously, and the online tool would give people an explanation of what might happen if we invest more or less in each category. So for example, if we decide to invest high in expanding the system and put maintenance at the bottom, you had to rank things kind of, there was a high, 2 mediums, and then a low you could choose from. So that would mean that we have more options for getting around, but we may have more potholes and things might take longer to fix. This really helps people kind of wrap their head around the difficult decisions we have to make as we fund transportation improvements. So the second question asked about preferences related to kind of, we talked about it as quality over quantity, or expanding versus improving. So an easy example of this that I like to start with is bikeways. So the question kind of asked, would you like to see more bikeways that use paint and flex posts that are built with cheaper materials but connect you to more places so there's more of them? Or would you like to see fewer bikeways, so those that are like built out of concrete or physically separated for moving vehicles in a trail or something like that, which costs a lot? So this question kind of asks people also like what neighborhoods people live in. So we'll be able to tie those community preferences for infrastructure to each neighborhood when we do that analysis of all of the planned projects that we've identified in each area. So as I said, the results of the survey will be able to tie directly to how we identify and prioritize projects moving forward, which brings me to the suite of new tools and resources that Denver Moves Everyone is developing to help us prioritize and program funding. I'll go through each of these real quick. So one of the critical tools produced through DME is the project database. So this is a comprehensive database of all of the projects that we've identified from more than 40 plans that have been produced over the past 10 years. The database also includes some recent additions from We did some gap analysis through the Never Moves Everyone effort to identify some of the gaps in those previously planned projects. So all in all, the database represents more than 6,000 projects. Some of those are tiny sidewalk, a lot of those actually are tiny sidewalk segments. But we have more than 6,000 projects that are all finally in the same place, the same format, and the same tool for the first time ever. This is built and maintained as a spatial geodatabase in GIS, for those of you who are familiar. So we can do some analysis for prioritization or any other needs that will arise as we keep doing planning and design work on our roadways, both now and into the future. So the next tool that we developed is the project scoring tool. We're working on this right now. This is our data-driven framework that ties the feedback and priorities we heard from that community survey that I just talked about to each project, and is going to assign each project with kind of a distinct score, so we can rank how projects tie to our values as a city, those goals we mentioned earlier, and some of the priorities for different folks in different neighborhoods. We'll be able to replicate this process in the future too, as we identify new needs in projects. So this isn't going to be just a static thing that we rank all the projects and we move on. We'll be able to continue to add things and reprioritize as we need. So once we have this ranked project or ranked list of projects, we're not done. We'll then use a fine-tooth comb to make sure that these projects make sense. We'll package projects together that have some leverage potential, and we'll distribute that constrained funding across our different investment categories or kind of buckets that we're allowed to spend money in. So in the coming months, we'll start to develop a few of these Excel-based tools that'll help us do this, and then develop our 6-year capital program. Brings me to the result of all this work will be a project and program list that identifies short, mid, and long-term priorities. So that short-term list will be our planned and funded list of things that we will accomplish in years 1 through 6. The medium and long-term projects will include some of those unfunded project needs that we still obviously need to do, but didn't quite rise to the top for prioritization or leverage potential. So I want to point out here that this will be an iterative process, and we'll have to redo this in future years as needs and hopefully new funding becomes available. So with that, I think I can pause and answer some questions. I know that was a lot of content all at once. So
yeah, thank you very much. I think you'll find this is a pretty plugged in group, and so they're going to want to go a little bit deeper. So let's jump right in. Rob Toffness had the first question.
cool.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious. What does the Denver Moves Everything get us that isn't already in previous plans? I remember taking those surveys, and it was great, I think, to ask the questions, but I've also noticed your average citizen is not very well informed about what it means to plan or build a city. I mean, I wasn't until I've had my head in this stuff for like 5 years. So does this allow you folks to really take your professional experience and do, what is the best thing, and not just what everyone may scream about in the surveys?
Yeah, that's a great question, Rob. So we tried to do a little bit better job here with community outreach. We did some things. Part of one of the aspects of this project actually that I got to manage was our community-based outreach partners. So we hired actually and paid members of the community to go out into what we call the inverted L neighborhoods. So that's the areas that we see the highest number of low-income folks, the highest number of people of color. And so these folks got to go out to these neighborhoods and disseminate the survey and really get to talk to folks on the ground. We had one guy that walked up and down Federal and just talked to random people as he approached them, like waiting for the bus or whatever. We had tons of community events that we went to in Montbello and Green Valley Ranch. So we feel like we got kind of a better segment of the community during the outreach for this project. And we're really trying to focus on how can we make informed data-driven decisions with this prioritization tool, so that we're not just listening to the squeaky wheel and the people that come to these types of meetings and are really well informed about planning and stuff, and try to make better decisions about how we prioritize our funding and projects in the future.
Yeah, great to hear. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks. Next, I have a question from David Mincer.
Am I on?
You're on.
Actually, I'm going to ask a slightly different question. Can you go back to the slide that showed the checklist of scoring for different projects?
Tell me when to
Yeah,
start.
yeah.
This one?
Just as an example, I've been following the I-25 and Broadway project pretty closely, and they say it is, multimodal, it's improving safety, it's going to decrease car use, which is kind of hard to swallow. So I worry that these kind of criteria are easy to manipulate. Will there be a community vetting process, or how can we hold them honest? Because almost any project, they'll say it's improving safety and it's sustainable.
Yeah.
But I think we've seen, various levels of that in practice.
Yeah, great question. So let's take a step back here. So the community outreach that we did for the first 3 phases is really informing all of the data and the metrics and the weighting for this prioritization tool. And so that's one part of it. The next part is I think we're going to do this in the fall. We will publish a draft list of prioritized projects for the public to comment on. So if you see, an I-25 pop up as number 1, you can say like, hey, DOTI, this
Right, so
doesn't look right.
The next up is a northbound ramp, and they came to the West Washington Park Association meeting to talk about it, and there was almost unanimous opposition, and they said, oh, well, we're going to do it anyway.
Oh,
So I just like, how can this be more responsive and accurate to community feedback?
yeah, I mean,
when they
we've
don't hear what
done-
they want.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this is probably the most comprehensive public outreach campaign that DOTI has done to date. And I can say with some confidence that we are doing everything we can to listen to all of the different voices that we're hearing in the city. And like I said, we don't want to just listen to the squeaky wheels. We're trying to make sure that we're using data to inform the decisions, and we'll be publishing that list for comment. So you'll be able to review it and tell us what you think in the fall when we're done.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David.
Thank you. I believe we've got Lucia Brown. It could be Lucia or Adrian.
Hi, I have a very unpopular opinion regarding community engagement. It's one thing to inform the community about what you're doing, but when you're asking people what they want, this is a pretty educated group here that you're talking to, but the general populace, they don't know what they want. They don't know what's going to be good for the city and good for climate change or whatever. They just know what they personally want, and it's not necessarily what's going to be good for the community as a whole. So when people say, well, I don't want bike lanes because it's going to take away the parking in front of my house, that's a really selfish motive versus something that's going to be good for the entire community, including their own community. So that's my issue with this whole community input stuff. It's one thing to inform the community, but this is getting the opinion of a lot of people who just have their own selfish wants. Doesn't seem to be very good as far as moving the community forward and reaching our greenhouse gas goals and vehicle miles traveled, et cetera, and all those things that you mentioned at the beginning.
Yeah, that's a good point. Unpopular opinion, but it's a valid one. I think that's the hard job of planners and of this project is how do we balance the things that we're hearing that people say they really want and really need versus our goals of the city. And there's not a right answer to that. But I really appreciate you bringing that up. And yeah.
Thank you, Taylor. Let me go a little bit further on that. DOTI has kind of developed a reputation for being really good at planning, but not so great on the follow through. We have all these different Denver Moves plans. Take Denver Moves Bikes was the first of those plans that had, pretty extensive network of protected bike lanes. But not only does it take a long time to do them, when it comes time to doing them, community input is often the thing that's cited for not doing them. So a protected bike lane becomes some sharrows, right? And so when I zoom back big picture, this is sort of similar to what was just said. I'd like to see an outcome of this effort be, we have the plans, we have used Denver Moves everybody to schedule when we're going to invest in what when, and then we're going to do it.
Mhm.
Is this going to help us do it and kind of get out of the if we planned it years ago, but if people want it, if the council member doesn't oppose it, if that we've been in?
Mhm. Yeah, Joel, I think that's exactly what this project is trying to do, is to try to lock us into, these are the projects that we're going to do in this next 6 years. We don't have currently anything like that. We don't have a project pipeline that goes 6 years out or even more years out. This is going to provide us with that tool to be able to say, no, this is our capital investment program for years 1 through 6, and this is what we're going to do. And we'll go out and inform the community about that, and we'll take some input on some specific project elements that haven't been defined yet. But yeah, I think this will really help us to be able to move forward and move more nimbly and quickly as an agency to build projects.
Or with less of a sense of hesitation and self-doubt, right? This is the plans, we've put them in place. And the vision that I could really buy into is what comes out of here is a sequence of when we're funding what, that then is communicated to elected officials at all levels, so they know that this is coming and that they won't be asked if they want to veto it at the last minute. They've known that it's coming. Is that a plausible vision for the future?
Yeah, for sure. I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Jack, one more question.
Yeah, I'll just repeat it. What is DOTI doing to get increased funding and support from the city? Like when we're looking at this tool and like the plan, it's like kind of with the assumption like, oh, we have like X funding and like capital investment or whatever. But it seems like a huge issue is just there's a lack of prioritization in infrastructure for equitable infrastructure. So like what is the city or what is DOTI doing other than, just like random citizens like us, like advocating for that kind of thing? Feels like it needs to come from a serious city agency.
Yeah, Jack, that's kind of the goal of this project is to have that data-driven scoring tool that tells us which projects align with our city goals and which projects will help reduce GHG emissions, which projects will help us move the needle on biking, walking, and transit trips, and to have that so that we don't have to just do projects because so-and-so emailed their city council person and said, I really want a sidewalk here. And they got enough stink up that that's the project that ended up getting funded. So this will help us be a little bit more diligent in the way that we program funding.
Right. And thanks for the info. But like, I think a big problem of the plan is like the timeline of all of these infrastructure changes seems so far out compared to, like, they seem very non-aggressive compared to like what other major cities are doing in the US of similar sizes. And it's like, if we increase funding, like what is like, is that a source to increase the speed of like these projects or do more projects at the same time? It's like, in parallel, like.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that this effort specifically is looking for more funding for the city. That's kind of not within the scope of this specific project, but I know DOTI, we have a like funding groups and folks that work on that, getting grants or looking for funding from the federal government or looking into bond measures and things like that. And folks are always looking for ways that we can get more funding, because you're right, we don't have enough funding to be able to do all the amazing things that we want to do to make Denver a world-class transportation system. And yeah, we're always working on it, and it's hard. A lot of those things require people voting to give their own money to the city. And that's not often a popular thing to pose to folks.
Well, Taylor, thank you very much for joining us. We tend to make these meetings pretty full in terms of a lot of different topics, so we're going to move to our next one. But do appreciate this and hope that you all will stay in touch with us as this comes into focus. I think this is the kind of group that would really appreciate in the last phase of the project, really seeing under the hood as it would be to see not just the high level prioritization, but really how's the prioritization playing out? Because there's so many other factors. Which projects qualify for which funding from the federal government, from Dr. Cog, and what time frame drives a lot of, when it's available and what you're going to do, provided that an effort like this found them worthy of pursuing. So if there's not ever an opportunity to do kind of the deeper dive as that comes into focus, this is a group that would really appreciate it.
Yeah, let's email about whenever the next time you guys meet is, and we'll figure out another time to come back. But in the meantime, mine and Sam's emails are on the screen. If you guys have any questions and want to reach out to us, feel free.
Thank you very much.
With that, I'll stop sharing my screen and hand it back to you. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to introduce Stephen Rijo. This is not Stephen's first time joining us. I'm really excited to have him back talking about micromobility. Recently saw a presentation that he gave to the DOTI Advisory Committee, and it's a pretty comprehensive look of what's going on there. Stephen, I've made you co-host, so you should be able to share your screen. And everyone, just to remind the tradition that we've come up with here in the past couple of years online is please propose your comments in the chat, and I'll pick from the on-topic ones to call on. You can, of course, ask your questions in your own voice. Stephen, how's the sharing look?
Should be good. Just getting my screen right here.
All right. And if we could leave a little time for questions at the end. I know you've got a lot of content to get through, and the floor is yours.
Excellent. So assuming you can see this, and yeah, definitely we'll try and leave some time for questions here. And yeah, if you saw my presentation to the advisory board, this looks somewhat similar. So we'll give you that update. So yeah, with that, my name's Stephen Rijo. I'm a principal city planner with DOTI's transit planning group. So whereas Taylor's on the bike planning team, I sit in our transit planning team, do a lot of traditional transit planning, things like BRT, Colfax, major corridor plans and service. But then I've also been kicking off a lot of our service programs more aimed at kind of the neighborhood scale, things like that. So our connector microtransit services, and then what I'm here to talk to today, our shared micromobility program. Obviously have a team doing a lot of this work. It is not just me. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about the history of the program, get into program management, talk a little bit about just the, really amazing ridership growth that we've seen, and end with a brief look ahead before getting into our Q&A. So I always like to start with this question. Curious if anyone has any tales, good, bad, happy, sad, about riding micromobility in Denver.
I think we'll probably end up using a lot of our time here, so if we could just ask you to plow through the presentation. Is that going to work for your flow?
Yeah, that's definitely fine. I think this is often just more useful to hear one or two anecdotes, what works for folks, but we will go through it. So with that, our brief history of shared micromobility had Denver B-cycle from 2010 to 2020. Unfortunately, when the contract was up at the end of 10 years, they chose not to renew. Around that time, sort of seeing the end of the contract, knowing these bikes and scooters, dockless mobility were coming on the scene around the world, we created our dockless pilot program. That was part of a transit amenity program we have at the city. From that, saw a lot of ridership, realized it made sense to formalize the program, and worked from roughly mid 2020 to when the licenses were signed in May of 2021 to select Lime and Lyft as our bike and scooter share operators for the city. And I highlighted there what the fleet started as, where it is today. That's for each operator. And that really, folks ask, why did you go about all this trouble? Why not keep a pilot program? We thought and have found since doing it that license leads to a partnership, leads to longer term outcomes, really allows the city to leverage a lot more value from the operator. So then with that, highlighting ridership through the entirety of our shared micromobility history that we have data for. This doesn't go back to B-Cycle, but in that several year span have done nearly 10 million trips. The median per day of those trips is just over 6,000. And based on data from Denver and kind of national data, that means we've replaced roughly 3.5 million driving trips. When you look at the license program with Lime and Lyft, that is 5.5 million trips, a median per day of over 12,000, a maximum single day of 36,000, which I often pause and say, that's up there with the traffic counts of a Broadway, a Lincoln, a Colfax. So in a single day, moving the number of people that some of our busiest streets do. And then again, that's replaced roughly 2 million trips. So you can see that in the last single year we've done more than half of our shared micromobility trips and just keep growing. And I will actually briefly say that for reference, B-Cycle, their busiest year was about 360,000 trips. So I'd like to contextualize that for folks. So then with that, some highlights on kind of the licenses in the program. Some of the requirements in the license, just pick some of the key ones. Data sharing is a big piece of this. You'll see a lot of slides in the remainder of this that highlight that. A really big piece that we heard from the pilot was that parking was difficult. And so we added a 2-hour parking response. Those photos at the bottom of the screen show the All-Star game now 2 summers ago, where a pile occurred. Some bad actors threw it together. Doesn't really matter how it happened. But during the pilot, had we seen one of these, we sent it to the operators, hey, can you clear this up? Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't, maybe out of goodwill. But we structured the license that where they have some pretty serious penalties that kick in if they don't resolve the issues within 2 hours. And so that photo to the right was sent to me about 15 minutes after I notified the operators, all those vehicles nicely organized. So kind of right, we have enforcement for our car parking. People seem to park all kinds of vehicles poorly. So it's how we respond to that. And the operators have not missed a response yet. We created opportunity areas to try and spread the vehicles out across the city. That was, have a slide on this later, but basically every morning, 30% of the fleet has to start in these opportunity areas, making it a more citywide program. We heard from folks such as yourselves that bikes were important. We saw that B-Cycle ridership and knew it was helping, hundreds of thousands of folks get around. And so we required a bike floor of 20%. And so using round numbers, if there was a scooter cap of 100, you would then need to deploy at least 20 bikes for 120 vehicles. You could over deploy the bikes. We set that as a floor so they could put out 100 bikes and double it. But that was a way that we saw, the operators and the interest of kind of residents was to have more scooters, but we know bikes are beneficial for familiarity, for longer trips, for a number of reasons. And so created that to leverage that. Building off the success of B-Cycle's 5280 free pass program, we created these programs with both operators. We'll talk about it a little more, but we've sort of been on hold and really getting those passes out, as we'd rather folks benefit from using those passes in a more robust program with more vehicles, more stations, more citywide, than really focusing on that last summer as we were still building things out, but have ramped that up this summer. I like to be clear that that is separate from our equity programs. So equity, anybody who qualifies for local, state, federal aid has access to near free use of both Lime and Lyft systems. Slightly different offerings, but if you go to our website, have that spelled out. And so I like to say that if you interact with populations who might qualify for this need-based benefit, let them know. Again, they can be getting near free transportation, definitely don't need to be paying full fare. And then, lastly, utilization-based fleet increases. So as there's more and more utilization, they can increase the fleet. And if there isn't utilization, then they can't. So that's how it's grown thus far. We partner with the Denver Regional Council of Governments, Dr. Cog, and a company called Ride Report to track this, and it produced a lot of the figures you're about to see. Doing a lot of work on stations and corrals, have some more slides there, but trying to give folks places to park these vehicles and expect where to find them. A lot of work on education and enforcement. So you can sort of see on the top that I'm doing everything from in-app messaging to push notifications to stickers on the vehicles that say how you can and can't ride them, and really trying to just, again, educate folks on this new mode of transportation, and then also enforcing some of the bad behavior. I want to call out the city's commitment to this program, that when we started it about a year ago, it was a portion of my time and a portion of some other folks' time, kind of adding up to one full-time equivalent. Now with a few new hires on our team and some more folks supporting, I'd say it's about 3 folks who are working on this at all times. So just upping the city's commitment to it. And then I like to take a moment to talk about technology, that while technology is a great tool. Here's an example of the geofence we have along 16th Street Mall. It is definitely more hammer than scalpel, as especially downtown, GPS drift and GPS accuracy can cause some challenges. So have some more info on this later, but definitely technology, something we use as we think it makes sense, but balancing the safety of all users, want to make sure that we're not confusing or causing safety hazards due to the use of technology, but definitely using it to educate, in-app messages, pushes, things like that. So wanted to highlight that both operators and ideally soon the city will be doing some more reporting, kind of those look back annual reports, but Lyft did a pretty comprehensive look last year, and it was really exciting to see, clearly that growth in ridership that I cited, but then also some stats about how folks who ride shared micromobility tend to be more diverse than Denver as a whole, and more multimodal than Denver as a whole. A lot of folks using it to connect to public transit, a large number of folks also not owning a vehicle, and a large number of folks using it every day of the week. So I think just encouraging, again, why we're trying to ramp this up and really make it a part of Denver's transportation network. And I think serendipitous that I followed Taylor, as it's a lot of the bike infrastructure that will help, what we've called bike lanes, but are really bike, scooter, multimodal lanes, get folks around the city. So with parking enforcement, again, folks park vehicles foolishly. Again, I think somebody took a lot of effort to do this, but hey, these things happen. It's how you react to it. And so in addition to the 2-hour response time, we've been building out corrals. So this is an example of a city corral, gives folks places to park personal bikes, shared bikes, scooters in that box as well. But then the operators have contractual obligations to install at least 400 stations around the city over the next few years. And so here are some examples of some Lime and Lift stations. And it's a chicken and the egg situation, but ideally we could get to a place where there's incentive or nudging within the app that's telling folks to make sure they park in these areas, things like that. So a lot of work's been going into this, and hopefully you've noticed some around your neighborhood. And sort of along with that, this is a heat map of the violations from those parking violations that we receive through our enforcement agents. We also have a way to enter these on our website. So you can go there and there's a form you can fill out to submit tickets if one of these is parked improperly on your property, or you see one causing an issue out there. And so we use that data in addition to ridership data to help cite those stations and corrals that I mentioned on the last page. And so a slide on the opportunity areas. You can see the dark shaded portions are the opportunity areas. We took DOTI's equity index, which is a compilation of indices, and just tweaked it to what we thought made sense for pulling those vehicles to places where they maybe haven't been before, and similarly where the demographic makeup of the neighborhood could really benefit from it. And it's been nice to see that helping make a more citywide program. Am I out there counting scooters every morning? No. We use Ride Report similarly to track that compliance. And again, the operators have been great. In those occasional hiccups that do happen, whether it's accidental or perhaps a violation, there are email notifications, and that's how we track a lot of this. So with that, transitioning to a few slides about ridership increases. And so the next few slides are June's over the last 4 years, June 2019, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And you'll see these same sort of 5 key metrics in addition to a ridership heat map of where folks are riding. And so in June 2019, pilot program, just over 120,000 trips with a maximum single day around 8,000, median trips closer to 4, and an average fleet of 700 vehicles. TVD is trip per vehicle per day. And that's a metric of utilization. It's what we use to base our fleet increases off of. I'd say for reference, a lot of other cities are pretty pleased if they see TVDs in the 2s. And so the fact that we are across the system seeing much higher numbers is really encouraging. So you jump to June 2020, that was also in the pilot program, definitely a unique time in our country and world. So don't need to belabor that, but seeing some increases in trips, some higher ridership single days, those medians going up, a much larger fleet, I guess nearly tripling by that point from where the pilot started, and a TVD around 3, again, still great, little lower. You can see that heat map expanding. So then when you get to the first month of the license program in June of 2021, trips up there in the high 300,000, maximum single day approaching 20,000, median daily trips just under 12, average fleet between both operators. So now this is the license program with Lime and Lyft, around 2,200, and a trip per vehicle per day of 5. Again, that's across bikes and scooters. Scooters do often see much higher TVD than bike. And then that heat map growing even further. And then this year in June, really encouraging, just sky high ridership. Again, this is nearly twice B-Cycle's busiest year in a month. And so over 600,000 trips, maximum single day of 36,000. Again, that's up there with a lot of our biggest arterials. Median daily trips of 18,000. So that's like A-line ridership in a day. That's again, some of our larger bus routes or arterials. So moving a significant number of people, and now a much larger fleet than we had in the early days of the pilot, still seeing some high TVD. So I made a quick GIF of that so you can sort of see the growth overlaid, and I'll let it run a few times through to sink in, but I think it is, again, encouraging that the charge, when I was managing our B-Cycle contract, was that we didn't really have a citywide program. And so it's been nice to actually have some tools to offer that, where many more neighborhoods in our city have access to bike and scooter share. I did want to call out that a lot of this data is available publicly. We have an open data portal. If you search that, you'll find it. And this is really an opportunity to better collaborate, peer cities, advocates, academics, folks such as yourselves, to be able to pull the data, see where ridership's happening, and know what's out there and isn't confidential. And so I encourage folks to go check that out if they haven't already. And then we also have our website with program info, again, things on how to ride, how to park, how to report a violation, sign up for free passes, things like that. So then wanted to take a moment to talk about events. This was opening day for Rockies this year. You can see a GIF of kind of where the vehicles were parking for, I think, what was around a 4, maybe 4:15 first pitch. And, we saw really high ridership. It was encouraging and really amazing to see that. Definitely some challenges associated with it when there are, thousands of vehicles converging on a handful of block area. And so it really made us realize that we needed to lean into event management a little bit more. And over the course of this year, have been partnering with our major venues. So Coors, Ball Arena, and Power Field, these places that get, tens of thousands of folks in a single day, single span of hours, and have really focused on reducing, the conflicts between the large groups of folks converging there, whether it's by, walking, biking, scooting, driving, and trying to organize the parking as well. And so this is one that's been coordinated and iterative, really learning a lot with each event that we do this at. And so I took a few screenshots from, this was, I think, game 1 of the Stanley Cup final, when we were partnering with Ball Arena to better manage that. And so some examples of the geofence we set up, some slow and no ride zones to help organize and avoid some conflicts there amongst users. You can see some of the preferred parking areas that we geofenced and sort of pushed riders towards. And you can see with the arrows on the right here that it really did a great job of organizing things. I would say we found this phenomenon that sometimes it's just beyond the geofence, just on the other side of the street, that folks see it and stop. So again, learning from this, how do we make that better? I often equate it to how in the early days of Uber and Lyft, you'd leave an event, it was pretty disorganized. How did we find our vehicle? Nowadays, there's often a queue, a place you go to. So creating that for this mode of transportation right now, and been really exciting. So last slide before some next steps and getting into Q&A. This is from the Stanley Cup Parade, which again, my team did a lot of work on making sure we could organize. And I think it's just really, amazing to see around 9 a.m. between there and noon how many vehicles converge on the parade, and especially at a time when it was nearly impossible to drive anywhere downtown to or through the core of the city. The fact that these provided mobility for so many folks, I think there were something like 30,000 trips done in a morning, which is pretty significant for a Thursday morning. So again, just showing how people are using these, they're using them a lot. What it's really highlighted is that we need to build more infrastructure than we ever thought we needed before. So a few things coming soon that hit on things I touched on before, and then we can save the next 10 minutes for Q&A. Protected bike lane, but really multimodal lane build out and prioritization. How do we use this data to say if there are 3 bike lanes planned for Lodo, which one should go first? And how do we say that actually maybe downtown we need some sort of lane on every street that we can fit it on because ridership is just so high and we need to create safe spaces for all. The station and corral build out's another really large piece of that, getting those free passes out into folks' hands, seeing how they use them and how we grow ridership and advance citywide goals to reduce driving. Really letting anybody who could fall into one of the equity programs know that, again, they can get near free use of both systems just by signing up. Having some more cap increases so that we can have a truly citywide program. I know I've heard some calls from folks who live in the more further flung corners of our city that they don't see as many of these, and they're not wrong. And so I think as we grow those fleets, that can be the case where in any neighborhood, you step outside of your door and within a few blocks, you can find a bike or scooter. Lots of events in education. I think we've been out there every few weeks so far this busy season. I say we, both operators, the city, events like Bike to Work Day, trying to give folks exposure to how to ride, what the rules are, but then also some test rides and just making it fun. And then I think, as we often say, there are things we definitely want to enforce and lean into. There are other things that are a bit of a chicken and the egg. And so I think as much as we can, we want to focus on how do we build out the infrastructure so that folks feel safe riding these, can really, nip that sidewalk riding in the bud, and then, hopefully have a place where there really is a safe space for everybody to use these vehicles. So I think it's been really interesting to see where we enforce and how that's helped. So I know that was a lot of content, as Joel hinted. With that, that's all I had, and happy to dive into questions. So.
Great. We've got about 5 minutes. So if I'd ask each person to just be as succinct as they can be. Rob has a question about corrals.
Yeah, I can express how frustrating it is to go walk along a sidewalk and you see a corral that's painted on the sidewalk, taking up sidewalk space when there is a parking spot in front of it that could have been better used for that. And these corrals have a lot of great uses other than storing bikes, as you know, like daylighting intersections. So how do we push the city to really get these corrals on the street instead of adding clutter to the sidewalk?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that was really important to me as well. As historically, auto-centric pricing has made it that it's much easier and cheaper to put things in the sidewalk space than it is below curb. The way we countered that in this program was basically saying it has to be at least a 50-50 split, or you can put more of them below curb. So of the 200 corrals that each operator is required to put in, they can only put 100 of those above curb. Had we not instituted this, I think 100% of them would have been above curb because it's near free and a little bit easier from an install standpoint. So that was something that was important to me to say. I couldn't agree more with how you put it. Let's cite a lot of these below curb. If for nothing else, it makes it so that trips don't need to start and end on the sidewalk, which we know is a challenge with sidewalk riding and millions of trips. So I really appreciate that question.
Can we as citizens push for a bigger difference in that split, more than 50-50?
I'm trying to think of the best. Definitely can always push. I'm trying to think of the most productive way to channel that. We really need to overhaul some of our just pricing that overvalues street space relative to pedestrian space. And I was proud of what we were able to do to get there, but I think you highlight a good point that can always push it further. So not sure I have a great answer for you on that one.
Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, let's move to Sean Brady.
I was wondering, how does it work for people that are handicapped? I guess different people got different levels of handicappedness. But in terms of, I think I asked before, and I think the answer was that it's not available for handicapped people. There's no special availability, but down the road, maybe have them delivered to the house, delivered to their property at the time they want to go the day before. I just wasn't sure how the handicapped access works for bikes.
Yeah, great question. And so since you've asked, that now is a live offering that Lime has. Lyft is still kind of feeling it out, but yeah, if you go in through the Lime Access, I believe is what it's called, or Lime Accessibility, you can find that information on their website, and it's an offering through the app. But it's exactly as you said, you request a vehicle. It's more of a daily rental situation, as they found that it often helps individuals if they can have it delivered, use it, and then have it picked up afterwards. So I'd be curious if anyone falls into that group that has tried it, or if they do try it, what they think. But really excited that Lime worked to make that offering so everybody can have some access to shared micromobility.
Let's see if we can sneak in a couple questions here. Wendy has a question about bikes.
Hi, yeah, thanks. I'm just curious about what the actual, I understand that the scooters have higher ridership, but I'm just wondering, what is the comparison between scooters and bikes in terms of ridership? For those of us who like the bikes, as Jack said in another comment here, but he likes the basket to be able to carry things. I just don't like the scooters. So what's the difference between the ridership?
Yeah, so speaking in generalities, as I haven't pulled it, this month, but how it sort of ran for the first year, I'd say it's roughly 85–90% of the ridership is scooters and the remaining is bikes. So again, if not for the city requiring bikes, I know the operators would only be deploying scooters. And I'm pretty encouraged. Some of you may have noticed Lime just rolled out their new bike offering. Suggest folks go try it. And they've been over deploying past the floor, almost double or triple, to try and match that need for folks like yourself who prefer bikes.
Thank you.
We have a couple comments in the chat that people have already tried the new Lime bikes, and it's positive, thumbs up. Last question here, Mark Christensen, a question about profitability and longevity.
Yeah, this just, 150 years of history of urban mobility shows that private solutions tend not to be profitable. I'll go through the history lesson, but just even my own experience with Car2Go burning us a few years ago, do you guys get any, are the vendors required to report anything about profitability to you? And I know that we now have contracts, so it's no longer just a pilot where the companies are here sort of trying things out. So we've got contracts, but what's the plan longer term when I think these companies invariably decide that the scooter business is not really profitable and they decide to pack up shop and head out of Denver and other cities?
Yes, I think question and some comments there, but to respond to the question, it is one of the selection criteria that we selected on was sort of their financial capacity to deliver this type of offering. So back when we selected in 2020 and 2021, that was one of the top line items. Like if you didn't clear that threshold, you weren't considered past that. So we're partnered here with two major operators in the industry. Lyft, I think, is the largest bike share operator in North America. Lime is the leader in scooter operations around the world, really. So, both running the numbers on how many trips they're doing and knowing what they charge per trip, they're certainly profitable in Denver. To your comment, how long that lasts, I think is an open question. As transportation planner, it is not lost on me that every form of transportation is subsidized somewhere, whether it's the roads people drive on or the airports their planes land at, right? So I do think, and maybe it's a good closing point, that when we selected the operators, they often would say, we want three things. We want a long-term contract, we want an exclusive contract, and we want a subsidy. again, we did the math and said, we think this can run without a subsidy and we want to give that an honest try. That was part of why we picked 2 operators. If one were to go, something were to change, we wanted there to be competition. Exclusivity, we said, we don't want there to be a monopoly. We'd rather there be competition, you know, Lime bringing new bikes and Lyft brings, like, there has been some good competition happening. So we went with 2, giving them a big enough piece of the pie that they could be financially sustainable, but also narrow enough that they or rather broad enough that folks have a couple options. And then long-term contract, doing the 5-year contract is how we extracted a lot of those free passes, stations, things like that. So hopefully that helps. And I think we're at time with that. So
we are. Thank you very much. I'll just add that in the chat here and also in the chat the other day at the DOTI advisory board, a lot of kind of comments about can't find bikes. And so hopefully more can be done so that people who are going longer distances or prefer the greater safety of bikes can find them. I would certainly echo that even in central Denver, where whether in the B-cycle era or in the pilot era, where there are multiple providers, you could pretty reliably find a bike, and that's not true anymore. Although the numbers of rides is much higher on the scooters, it's probably because of the availability of scooters.
Yeah, and I think it's a great comment that, again, bikes are really important. It's why I fought for the 20% as we were inking these contracts. And I do think folks will be encouraged to see that, you know, where currently for each operator, again, the floor is around 400, 500 bikes, depending on how many scooters they have out there. I know that today Lime had something like 1,000 and is planning with their new bike rollout to have closer to 1,200 by next week. And so I often say that, you know, B-Cycle at its peak, I think had 780, call it 800 bikes between Lime and Lyft. We have 1,500 to 2,000 on any given day. And so there are more bikes out there. They're just a little more spread out. But yeah, I'm constantly trying to encourage more bike ridership, as I do think folks really like those vehicles, and they do statistically do longer trips than the scooters. So.
Great. Well, thank you very much. This is a beautiful presentation that you put together. I mean, wonderful data and wonderful visualization of the data. And we're lucky to have the person who knows most about this in the city presenting to us. So keep up the great work and keep evolving the program.
Yeah, thanks for your help, and let us know how we can keep making it more useful for folks. So
thank you. All right, we're now going to go to Jay Decker. Now, Jay is in an interesting spot. He's in transit right now, so I am going to share his presentation. And Jay, let us know that you're there.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, apologies. In transit, but I am not the one driving, so safety first. But because of that, I won't be able to have my camera on, and Joel will be my Vanna White today, just running through the slides. So thank you, Joel.
All right, and I'll just introduce Jay. Jay's going to talk obviously about shared streets. I've been bugging Jay. He can attest for the better part of a year to say, okay, we're winding down the shared streets from the pandemic, but there's such support for the idea. What are we going to make of this? And we finally are getting what I think is the earliest look we've gotten at anything. So Jay, take it away.
Well, thank you, Joel. And yeah, I want to applaud you for your persistence. We had some kind of issues with some funding and things like that, typical city procurement issues that delay things. But thankfully, we are all past that, and we are officially unbuttoning our arm sleeves and rolling them up and getting to work. So next slide, please. So for today, because we are just now getting started, we don't have as much data to show you as, say, Stephen did with Micromobility. So we're going to recap a little bit of what our temporary shared street program entailed, and then get into what our game plan is for the permanent program, and then end by asking for some feedback from this group. Next slide. So we'll get into temporary shared streets here. So first of all, this might be painful for some, but kind of putting us, back into the mindset of a couple years ago. COVID hit us hard. Most of us were working from home. Everyone at DOTI was told to go home, and about 2 weeks after that, we started seeing and hearing a lot of reports about Our parks were just kind of flooded with folks. Our streets and sidewalks were experiencing way more traffic. And this was certainly before we knew anything about outdoor transmission or masks. And so people were doing their best to give 5-foot berth. But many, if not most of our sidewalks in Denver are no wider than 5 feet. So that required people to go into the street. And as much as, we wanted to have safety, people in Colorado, you cannot keep us inside no matter what, even a state order. So we knew people were going to recreate and move around. And so we decided that we needed to lean into, having some of these shared spaces, converting them from vehicles to people first spaces, because people weren't necessarily driving as much in that moment. And so we did this all in a matter of 1 week. So for kind of all the flack that local government can frankly rightly get about moving slow, when we do put all of our attention and effort into something, we can move fairly quickly. And I think that's representative here. So what we did is we planned, designed, and built these shared streets in essentially 1 week. The planning effort entitled around looking at where park deserts were in the area. So looking at parks and then parkways, and then any areas that didn't have access within a 5-minute walk. Thankfully in Denver, we do have fairly good park coverage, but it doesn't cover everywhere in the city. So you can actually see there's a decent amount of gaps there. And because we only had so many resources, we sadly couldn't put a shared street in every one of them. So we then qualified those gaps with residential density. So meaning, with everyone staying at home, where would some of these impact the most amount of people? And then because residential density in Denver often equates to some of the more affluent areas in Denver, we wanted to make sure that we did have some of the more kind of equity focused locations that weren't necessarily super dense, but were certainly in areas of need. So that was the planning. We went ahead and kind of did just traditional kind of construction type traffic control design. And then we actually kind of built it and put it out there, rented and bought some materials, threw them together, kind of created our own signage, and really was the first city to do this at scale at such a level. Next slide, please. And what resulted, there were, some signage about COVID and social distancing, some of those familiar blue signs, if you remember them. And really what happened was we created 11 corridors and 7.5 miles. I think what's important to note here is that while shared streets became a very popular thing after this, Denver's really was one of the only cities where it was 100% our city program. So planned, designed, built, financed, maintained, all of that. Many other cities that got to be a little bit bigger after us had a lot of participation and funding and other resources to draw on. And I'd like to think we were the inspiration for a lot of that. Next slide, please. And what happened is, people enjoyed it. It's probably not too crazy to talk to this group that, hey, if you take a lot of the cars off the road, people will feel more comfortable using that space. That's really what we saw. And so our data was one of the best things that we did during this time period is we put out tube counters at many of these locations and we left them out for months. So we have days and days and weeks and months of data really showing how people use these streets. And what we saw collectively is that there was a tremendous decline in the number of vehicles on these streets. Certainly there was less people moving around the city as a whole, but the travel in Denver did not drop this amount, not even close. And so there certainly were having a big impact for that. Of the vehicles that were on these streets, because these areas still needed to, people needed to get to their homes, we had more deliveries, things like that. Those vehicles were going markedly slower. And then as a result, on a good day, we had over 10,000 people across the city using these. It really was a tremendous amount. I think over 1 million people used these in the first 6 months. And one of the great things is that, all naively, we all thought that, we'd put these out for 30 days and then we'd kind of be back at work. That obviously didn't happen. And it was due to a lot of residential support. So probably many of you enjoying them, talking to your council members and mayor and things like that. And then all of the council members wrote to the mayor agreed, let's keep these out. And that is how we got to keep them out for the better part of 2 years. Next slide, please. Going into the fall, we knew that we needed to make some changes. While successful, it was a tremendous amount of maintenance work. We had Parks and Rec counter folks actually, you know, being repurposed and driving trucks and moving those barricades around, and had a lot of inspectors going around, and we're paying different folks to do that. And it worked for a while, but we kind of had what I would say kind of dueling groups. Some folks really enjoyed these, some folks did not. And so there actually would be Facebook groups, you know, some against, they'd go out in the middle of the night, remove the barricades, and the ones for it would go out in the next morning and put them back. And we even had folks that liked them so much that they would take the barricades and put them in front of the streets on their house because they wanted a shared street right in front of their house. And of course, all that means is we need to track them down and put them back into place to remain safety. So it was quite a lot of work. And we also knew that with winter, those types of barricades just, they don't work well. We can't plow with them in the road. They're not meant to really be out there in the winter, certainly not for that long, and it was going to cause issues. And so what we did is, for some of these locations, we actually installed some of the bike infrastructure that was meant to be on that street later in the year. And so we just did that a little bit earlier. Some of the locations we actually kind of realigned with community plans. So areas that maybe weren't as successful as we thought they would be, we more realigned them with what the community had said in the past would maybe be a good shared street. We saw more success there. And then really just leaned into kind of more innovation using different type of materials that would work better for maintenance and then also for the winter. Next slide. So this is kind of what we pivoted to. So going from those, what we would call type 3 barricades, they've got kind of the 3 horizontal structures, to water-filled jersey barriers. And so then these could withstand an impact. They didn't move. We put them in an area where we could plow them a little bit better, and all around just was better material, just with a little bit higher capital costs. Next slide. And this one's Bayad's a good example of kind of leaning into bike infrastructure we had planned on the street, and then also adding a few extra elements. And so you can see we've got the leftmost slide there is what we call diversion. And so not allowing one lane of traffic to drive through, but allowing bikes to come through. So no more right turns off of Lincoln onto Bayard. So reducing the number of cars in that realm, and increasing turning radii and stuff like that to functionally slow the vehicles down that were on this road to maintain that comfort. Next slide, please. So that really gets us into kind of what we have on our plate now, developing that permanent shared street program and incorporating all of those lessons learned. So what we're looking at here is that we used all the numbers, looked at all the support that we received, and ultimately made the decision that this was so successful. People in Denver love to bike and walk and recreate in spaces that aren't unsafe and don't feel unsafe. And so we want to create more of those streets in Denver. We're able to secure $250,000 to help with that development effort. And really, the idea is we want to capitalize on the momentum to deliver people first streets. If we were to have tried this prior to the pandemic, it would have been relatively small, or frankly wouldn't have happened at all. What typically happens when we try to be really innovative and big thinkers is we get a lot of noisy folks, the folks that hate change and are a little scared of something like this. And so they immediately oppose it. And that can, require us to make changes or not do something at all. In this instance, we didn't talk to the community. We just went ahead and did it. And those traditional people that may not have liked this realized that they actually did enjoy something like this. And so we kind of ripped the Band-Aid off, and we need to make sure we capitalize on that. Next slide. So some of the open questions we had, and like I said, we didn't really talk to the community when we did it. So now is our opportunity to do that. What does the community think and desire for the future? What were those lessons that we learned from the 16th month of kind of having a living lab? These things evolved and changed over time. What did we learn? Which of these existing streets The ones that have the temporary shared streets are good candidates to be permanent. And frankly, what other streets in Denver that we didn't consider should be considered, and which ones would be good candidates, and really how do we accelerate our traditional delivery model to make sure that we do create these and bring them back before people kind of forget, what the experience was like, and don't support them as heavily as they would now. Next slide. So as far as kind of what we've got on our docket looking about the next 6 to 8 months is needing to have those conversations with the community. So we're kind of in that phase right now this summer. We have kicked off the project and we're working on our community engagement strategy right now. And we'll be reaching out to the public here very shortly to get information on kind of what people's thoughts and feelings were on the existing program and what do they like to see in the future. We'll then use some of that information and then run some GIS and survey analysis to kind of figure out, which of these streets would be good candidates to move forward in the future, and what are some of the other streets in Denver that could be considered. There's many streets, Colfax, stuff like that. It would never be a shared street, right? But I think there's several streets, many probably in front of your houses that probably could be really good candidates, and we want to make sure we look at a citywide approach for that. And then we'll kind of get into the kind of the nerdy design stuff on what does something like this actually look like. We don't really have a lot of shared streets in Denver. We have about a block up on the 39th Avenue Greenway. Should it look like something like that? Curbless, warning detection. Is it bricks? Is it asphalt? Is there something that we could do that isn't so design and cost intensive, so we can actually produce more of these, similar to what we do with our protected bike lanes, with some of those paint and posts that frankly aren't necessarily the most attractive option, but allow us to be cost effective so we can put more of them in Denver. And then we'll circle back in kind of the early part of spring and actually finish up and finalize that program, come back out to the community, get their thoughts, make some final tweaks based on what we did on some of the internal analysis and conversations. And then we'll request funding for the following year to actually start designing and implementing these based on our analysis and prioritization. Next slide. So this is the second to last slide, and one that I think is going to be the most important. We really need to think big here, but I think it's really important to act quickly. When we talk about shared street design and more permanent versions, it's very similar to the photo that you see in front of you. Curbless, bricks, making sure that we have really good high quality urban design, green infrastructure, things like that would be lovely to have in Denver. The problem with these is this takes many, many years and tens of millions of dollars to do. And so this is something we're going to create and move towards in Denver, but we may get, a couple blocks of this every few years. It's important to have this high quality infrastructure, but I think what we need to also focus on are the things that we can implement maybe seasonally, that folks can experience these kind of shared streets, maybe over the course of a summer in their neighborhood, things like that. So they understand what they are, what it means for their travel, that they support it, and that we can meet some needs in the interim while we do all of the hard, diligent work of having those conversations with the community, designing, worrying about utilities, all the boring stuff to get to the point where we can finally build something really impressive and nice like this. So next slide. So this gets to the point where I want to have a bit of a conversation in the last 9 minutes here. What are some of the folks' general thoughts on our approach? And as far as community engagement goes, we want to make sure that we do have a representative audience for the whole of Denver, but we also want to make sure that we do get some folks that really know what they're talking about, that maybe rode on these and enjoy them and support them, so we can have a really loud voice to tell the Department of Transportation and City Hall that we do need a lot of funding and a lot of resources, because this could be quite a transformative set of projects in Denver if we have the right resources to move it forward. And that won't happen unless we talk to the right people and and get the right response. So with that, I'll open it up for questions or comments. Joel?
Yeah, let's give some feedback and ideas. I think I first saw Jack with a question. It was a general.
Yeah, sorry, I had to find that one again. I was basically just asking, with like the talk about how we made so many great actions during the pandemic to just make these shared street changes, is that kind of power we only saw you had during the pandemic, or is that something we can just continue? Is kind of like my question.
Do you mind rephrasing that? Like, what do you mean? Just moving quickly for other projects, or kind of implementing in a temporary fashion like this?
Yeah, like, oh, like, plan a design in a week and implement it, like for a shared street, for example. Like, we see the need and we implement it like right away. Like, it doesn't need to be a year-long design process.
Yeah, it's a good question. The photo you see in front of you, we can do that in a week. The problem with that is, our city traffic engineer always likes to say, whatever we put in the streets, someone will eventually hit it. So we have a lot of distracted driving, other things, certainly just with time, people hit things. These aren't meant to be permanent. If they get hit, it's a lot of maintenance, it's safety issues. Certainly you can see, there's ice and things like that. It's not working well in the winter. And so part of the reason, if not a majority of the reason why we were to move so quick, is because it was temporary. A lot of the times when we go slow is because it's going to be out there for 10 to 20 years. So we want to make sure we get it right. And so I don't think we can do these in a week, but I think we can accelerate our traditional timeline if we get the appropriate resources to do so. But we need to find that middle ground between doing it quick, but not having something that's sustainable to leave out there very long, versus trying to think and do everything perfect and for it to take years and years.
Okay, David had a question about feedback.
Hi, thanks. I think there's a lot of frustration out there that we had a year and a half to engage the community, to collect data, to conduct surveys, and really hardly anything was done in that domain. I didn't see a single survey put out by the city to ask how the neighborhoods were responding and what kind of iterative improvements we could do. Parks and Rec closed streets, and they were very aggressive in trying to get feedback and coming up with a plan that could evolve their program rather than kind of scratching it and starting all over again. It feels like we wasted a good year and a half when that was really the best opportunity to do something. And I'm just wondering why there were no surveys, why we weren't engaged while the streets were in place.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And Parks really did a great job of leaning in the moment and doing some of that. Although I will say a little bit easier to close a street than to have a shared street with all the different modes. The reason why is we didn't have any city function ones, but we did work with the Denver Streets Partnership. We did assist them with their surveys, with responses. We had workshops with them on how we can improve these. And we did something a little bit different. Instead of a digital survey, we actually, as part of another effort, we actually added shared street questions into a city polling service where they actually did call and email to different folks. That is statistically significant. So surveys are great, but they only really work for people that see them and take the time to participate. And so they can often be very biased. But we went with the phone polling effort where we got a significantly significant amount of folks in Denver to respond. So we knew that it was an excellent representative sample of what general folks were feeling about. And it was very positive. And so that led to us making the decision to make it permanent. And we would just want to go back and kind of redo our homework and talk to people on a deeper level now.
Can you speak to why the decision was not made to kind of make an to improve these streets we had, replacing the orange barricades rather than kind of starting over again? Other cities have done that. I'm wondering why we weren't able to.
When other cities have done it, it's because it was already with pre-planned infrastructure, or frankly, you see the headlines and then when you follow up, they really haven't done it at all. Like I said, these things are not meant to be out there very long. This is temporary construction materials. We don't want these to be out there for very long for safety reasons. A lot of people think they look ugly. So we want to make sure that we fit the ground where it works well and is sustainable longer term. So that's kind of where we want to start over. But I don't know if starting over is the best word. We learned a lot. We collected a lot of data. We talked to a lot of folks. We have confidence to move forward now. We just need to actually physically get those guidelines written and actually put the pen to paper and create them.
We've got just about 3 minutes left. Let's see if we can get some concise comments here. Tiffany? Tiffany had a comment about streets that go by schools seem like naturally good candidates for shared streets. And I think we could expand that to a lot of residential streets where I think there's a pre-existing concern about population growth, trip growth by cars causing a lot of what neighborhoods refer to as cut-through traffic or people going speeding through neighborhoods. So neighborhoods and schools maybe could be a priority. Wendy.
Hi, yeah, lots of thoughts. But yeah, like David said, I feel like we should, and rather than just getting rid of what we already put up and what people got used to, we should build on it. I'll take safe over ugly, to be honest. I mean, I prefer something less ugly than this was on the screen, but I'll take safe over that. Also, yeah, definitely clearing ice from these areas. This bike lane in this image is full of ice, so there are a lot of places where that occurs, and the ice can stay there for weeks at a time. Gosh, what else? Yeah, it's just really frustrating. I have to say that to hear, the limitations into implementing safe, really actual safe bike infrastructure rather than just sharrows and paint. When we spend so much money on highway changes and updates and expansions and all that, and everything else we spend on streets. So I don't know, too much to say. But yeah, I just think we need to prioritize these projects, build it, and we come. The e-bike rebate program is a great example of that. People are dying to get those rebates to get those e-bikes and get out on the road, but at the same time, we don't have safe roads for them to ride on, and people are scared for that. So I feel like we just need to push it forward and make it happen. I'll stop there.
Yeah, well said. I think a really important statistic for everyone to remember is that a little over 1/3 of all real estate in the county of Denver is the right-of-way. So that is a significant portion of our city that is devoted, frankly, mostly to vehicles. So if we can peel just a little bit of that away to create safer spaces for folks, really shouldn't impact how people move around in cars, but will really move the needle about how people feel safe to move around in different modes.
Let's just get a last couple comments from Jack about seasonal facilities and Jillian about Bayard. Jack?
Yeah, really quick. I was just saying, I think we should be careful about committing in the beginning to seasonal infrastructure, like shared streets only in the summer, for example, because you'll still have a lot of opponents to fully making it a permanent shared street. Like when you don't make it a permanent shared street, people will still drive, and like that doesn't really lead to good multimodal shifts.
Thank you. Caution or suspicion about seasonal facilities. Jillian?
Yeah, you mentioned Bayard, and I happen to live right there, so I'm curious if you could update sort of on its status. It seems like some of the changes are permanent, but the use is sort of unclear now, if it's just a bike lane or if it's still sort of in that shared street status.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the shared street, temporary COVID program actually ended last summer. So we removed all the barricades, removed all the signs. And so Bayard is what we would call a neighborhood bikeway. So it's slowing vehicles, deterring some vehicles, which makes it safer and more comfortable for people to bike on it. But I wouldn't recommend that people kind of walk or play on that street, since that's not what it's intended for. It's a bike facility now. but that's not to say it can't be a shared street in the future if we get enough support.
Well, thank you very much for joining us, Jay. I think we're hearing a lot of appetite here that was verbalized and also in the chat for maintaining as much of that just get it done momentum that we had during the pandemic, and maybe the way to frame that going forward is, some process that you're going to lead to identify candidates, and then actually the same kind of infrastructure that we use, the temporary infrastructure, but truly as a prototype. So every month tweaking it and changing it until we come up with what really works, and then doing that with better materials. So prototyping is a word that Denver throws around a lot, and they do something with lesser materials that's cheaper to prototype, but then it could be there for a decade. I don't think that's what people had in mind with prototyping. So this could be the project that shows Denver how to prototype, how to prove, change, tweak, and then really know what you're going to do because you've demonstrated it.
Wonderful. Well, I really appreciate the comments and the energy here. A lot of smart folks on the call, and we promise we'll certainly circle back, and please stay on the lookout for Joel probably sending some emails on getting some feedback and all of that. The stronger voices that we have in that room means the quicker and the more impactful we can be. So really appreciate your support and your vision.
Thank you very much. And INC and the other advocates on the call will help get out the word when you have something for us to share. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, everyone.
And the final topic on our agenda is freedom to walk. Alan Cowgill and Jacob Smith, and I'm told someone else will be joining as well. I'm sorry. I have made you, Alan, a co-host, so you can share your screen, but let me know if somebody else needs to be, and tell us about your work on freedom to walk.
Great. Well, Joel, thank you so much for joining us. Jake Cohen is here. By the way, the newly elected DOTI advisory board co-chair. He's here tonight. I think more as an individual is a co-chair of that, but we're excited to have him. So shout out and congrats to Jake on that. And Jacob, thank you so much for joining us as well. Thank you all for giving us the opportunity to speak here at this group tonight. I will share my screen, and Jake's going to take it away, but I also want to acknowledge that Rob Toffness is here too. He's been an integral part of this, and Lucia Brown has also, I don't know if she's still here tonight, but she's also been a big participant in this process as well too. So let me go share my PowerPoint screen here, and let's see if you all can see it here. Visible to everyone?
Looks perfect.
Great. Jake, would you like to take it away and introduce the concept to everyone?
I would love to, but first, I think Alan's being a little coy. He's also the new secretary for the DOTI advisory board. So congratulations to him as well. But yes, we're very excited to talk to you all about freedom to walk. Freedom to walk is something that I think means a lot to all of us that are involved. Freedom to walk is the decriminalization of walking on public streets. So our primary objective is to decrease unnecessary interactions between law enforcement and communities of color. We don't want tragedies like Elijah McClain to happen here in Denver. We've got a lot of inspiration for projects like this where we can decriminalize things that really are normal behavior that are not necessarily unsafe. Examples like Colorado Safety Stop, removing armed guards from the RTD N-Line commuter rail pilot, and replacing them with conductors. And then we've also seen awesome work in Kansas City, Missouri. If you ever get the chance to look into some of the work that they've done there, highly recommend it. But there's some awesome movements around the country in Virginia as well, working to really address this issue. So what are we trying to do? So there was a key recommendation from the Denver Task Force to Reimagine Police that was to minimize unnecessary interaction of law enforcement and the criminal legal system with communities around minor traffic offenses. And we want to modernize Denver's code to bring it in line with how streets are already safely being used today. I think there are very few of us on this call that haven't occasionally crossed a street outside of a crossing. So I think we can all relate to that. So most importantly, and I think this is the key takeaway, right? Is we are not seeking to legalize pedestrians walking in front of cars, right? That's going to be the key. key fear that people might have. But Colorado state law already covers vehicular right-of-way, and that pedestrians need to yield the right-of-way to all vehicles upon the roadway. What we want to address is that Denver's code is stricter and frankly not evenly enforced, and we want to address and reconcile the difference.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Jacob Smith here, West Colfax resident, and I'm going to take the next few slides. So thank you, Jake, for kind of sharing the main point. We're not seeking to legalize pedestrians walking in front of cars. Ultimately, we want there to be an environment where we're prioritizing all road users and making them safe and accessible for them. But currently right now, the way walking is being criminalized for pedestrians. And in Denver, the fine is between $65 to $95, which actually totals up around $3 to $4 a day, and can drastically impact someone's economic status for a month, and really affect their bills and all the multiple things that's going on in their life. But furthermore, the current criminalization disproportionately affects unhoused folks and communities of color. Out of the 125 jaywalking cases, I believe there were about 35 that were going, 35 that were going to unhoused folks, and then the majority of communities of color. So it's directly impacting folks, through this criminalization. Next slide. So yeah, although 10% of Denver's population is Black, 41% of jaywalking citations are given to Black residents, and the majority of these are given to minority neighborhoods, and we have reason to believe Latinos are disproportionately targeted as well. So it's pretty much a huge cycle. It's the history of us prioritizing vehicles over pedestrians, and then this history of us ongoingly disproportionately impacting people of color, folks who are unhoused, and those who are the folks who use our transit and are folks who oftentimes do not have access to a vehicle. So we're putting an undue burden on those folks and our residents, and it doesn't have to be that way. So on to the next slide, a little bit about this whole reasoning. So we've discussed the criminalization of walking and how it impacts these marginalized groups. And then we've also recognized that we're not seeking to, legalize. We just want to make sure that we are enforcing these laws in an equitable manner, and that we are ensuring we're not prioritizing cars over other road users. Now, it's important to recognize as well that our entire system, statistics show, there's been multiple reports that show that in actuality, it's not pedestrians making irrational decisions. It's not pedestrians just getting in front of a car, a truck, just for no reason. It's actually our cities that are being designed dangerously, that are not prioritizing pedestrians. And as you can see here, people of color, particularly Native and Black Americans, this was a new article that just came out, and I think someone just put, America Walks as well as Smart Growth America, 4.8 times more likely to be struck by a vehicle. And that is through the poorly designed infrastructure and lack of safety features within driver behavior. So as you can see here, we are impacting people of color through our dangerous designs by not creating accessible sidewalks, not creating bike lanes, and not creating a safe and mobility system. But then we're also impacting this same group by having enforceable laws that are disproportionately impacting them as well. So really the freedom to walk is recognizing that we want an environment, a safe and mobility system that is for everyone. And although we believe in safe infrastructure, we believe in laws, and we believe in, the safe systems approach, we want to make sure that we're not, enforcing this law so much that it's hurting disabled folks and people of color as well. So streets are unsafe ultimately because of speeding, distracted driving, and the dangerous road conditions and the lack of infrastructure. Pedestrians aren't unsafe because of their own decisions. And the next slide, I think, last. Yeah, so does jaywalking make streets more dangerous? No, jaywalking is an offense in the United Kingdom, and they actually have less pedestrian death rates than United States. Furthermore, our peer cities such as Seattle show that most vulnerable road users are not people that are jaywalking, but they're actually elders, children, intoxicated folks, disabled folks who are trying to use the same system that are being prioritized for cars.
So the next thing we want to chat about is who else is doing this right now. Jake alluded to this a little bit before. Kansas, there's been a couple different approaches that we've seen around the country. Kansas City, Missouri completely wiped the jaywalking laws off their books, along with a couple of other laws that they saw that were being disproportionately enforced against communities of color. That unanimously passed through their city council. Virginia took a slightly different approach. Instead of removing it from the books, they kind of made it a secondary offense. In other words, they said that police can't stop people on the street simply for jaywalking. And we haven't seen Vision Zero data out of Kansas City, Missouri yet, specifically around pedestrians. But we have seen Vision Zero data from 2020, the year that it was implemented, from Virginia. And there was not a measurable change in pedestrian fatalities versus driver fatalities. Unfortunately, both of them were up about 10%, but we did not see a remarkable difference. Again, that's following the overall national trends of, unfortunately, fatalities being up nationwide for people that are walking, driving, biking. But we're not seeing a remarkable difference. There's not a massive spike there. Similar efforts have been underway in places like California, New York, and Washington State. And again, we talked about, Jacob mentioned this, Europe, this really isn't a thing, and a lot of their pedestrian fatality statistics are half that of the United States. So, trying to hit the next slide here. So what would change? First of all, we're starting the conversation at a local level right now. Colorado state laws regarding pedestrians and crossing the right-of-way would remain in place. We think those are fairly reasonable. We'd like to see some things change about those for sure, but right now we're just talking about Denver. So our goal is to remove Denver's stricter code language around walking and rolling as well. There's a lot of implications for our current code of impacts for wheelchair and powered wheelchair users that we'll talk about here in a minute. And the other thing that we want to have a conversation about is putting provisions in Denver's code that certainly we can't rewrite the state law, but we'd like to emphasize that law enforcement, Denver police should make this their lowest level priority. For those of you that've been around Denver for a while, you might remember that there was a ballot measure saying that around cannabis, saying that Denver police should make cannabis their lowest priority regarding in law enforcement. So we want to have conversations if something similar could take place for jaywalking to remove these interactions between law enforcement and the community on this activity that's a relatively safe thing to do. So what are we going to compare here? When crossing the road outside of crosswalks, so let's focus on the time that we're not crossing in a crosswalk, but outside of crosswalks, Colorado law says that pedestrians must yield to cars no matter where crossing, right? You're not going to walk out in front of a 210 truck coming down the road. It's a pretty common sense thing, but that's also the way the law is written. And then Colorado law also says that between two adjacent intersections with traffic signals, in other words, block to block, you've got traffic signals on both blocks, pedestrians must cross at the intersection. Pedestrians cannot cross diagonally unless it's authorized. Some of you may be familiar with the term dancing in Denver, this thing that Denver at one point, a lot of folks would diagonally cross at Denver. That was part of our crosswalk network downtown, but actually removed that, I think about 5 or 10 years ago. So really, it was just about car throughput. It was interesting, but that's a tangent. So Denver law is stricter, and that typically speaking, if you look at the code, it does not allow crossing any arterial or collector streets. So an arterial street is something like Federal Boulevard or Colfax or Colorado Boulevard. A collector street is these kind of more two-lane roads typically. So this would be something like 32nd Avenue or Irving or Lowell. You can tell I'm from North Denver, so I'm quoting places that are over here, but you probably get the idea. They're typically commercialized streets or have a little bit more traffic or a 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. But right now in Denver, you can it only gives you flexibility to do some of these walking across the street on local streets. Another thing that we want to talk about is walking in the road. Right now, Colorado law is pretty broad with regards to walking in the road. It says when there's no sidewalk, pedestrians must walk on the shoulder or as far to the side of the road as possible if there is no shoulder, or walk in the opposite direction of traffic if it's two-way street. It's not explicitly saying that you can't walk in the road. It's saying like, this is more giving you guidance as to what to do when there's no sidewalk. Denver law is pretty strict with this. It's saying if there if there's a sidewalk present, you cannot walk in the road. And this is pretty egregious. There's definitely some systemic issues here because 30% of Denver, and a lot of you're going to see here, most of you, if you followed the sidewalks campaign, 30% of Denver has substandard or narrow sidewalks. Oftentimes, these are communities of color that have not gotten the same investment as other communities. So they're too narrow. In a lot of cases, you can't put a wheelchair on there. You can't put a stroller on there. You can't put a walker on there as well. So we're essentially forcing people, legally speaking, to use these sidewalks that aren't really safe or accessible for so many people. And we didn't really talk about it in that last presentation, but one of the reasons that it was many reasons why, the Shared Streets program kind of, temporarily was put on hold, but was because of this law. So this is something that could also help some of our work around the Shared Streets program as well. For folks using a wheelchair or powered chair, when rolling outside of the crosswalk, Colorado says that wheelchair users are to be treated as pedestrians and follow the same laws. So, again, a much more broad base of things that you can do there. Denver law is quite a bit stricter. It does not allow people in wheelchairs or powered wheelchairs to use the street when there is a sidewalk or crossing, when there's a sidewalk or across the street outside of crosswalks when there is a curb ramp. And if you look around Denver, there's a lot of places with curb ramps where the sidewalks are disrepaired, or oftentimes, as you all know, in the wintertime, the sidewalks are not unshoveled and they're absolutely impassable for our community members that are using wheelchairs or powered chairs. And I've had friends that are wheelchair users that have absolutely said, I will use the street when there's a sidewalk because most of our sidewalks are in disrepair. So effectively, this is very common practice that's been used by folks that's illegal right now. So what's next? We're in the process of meeting council members to kind of finalize a code update and proposal and define a legislative calendar. But we want to really gather community feedback on some proposed changes. And I think this is probably the most tuned in group with regards to transportation issues in the city. So we really wanted to have Jacob kind of lead a discussion on our end around what do folks have on thoughts of this and what questions you might have on this.
Yeah, I don't see any questions right now. I just see the comment from Jake, but yeah, please feel free to ask some questions.
Great. One of your slides, so while we're waiting for other questions to come in, one of your slides showed the Denver inverted L. And, there's so many things that correlate with that pattern. It can be incomes and ethnicity, but we've also seen, traffic fatalities, et cetera. What you seem to be showing was police enforcement of jaywalking rules. Could you bring that up again and walk us through it? Because I think what we're talking about here is not only the laws in Denver and what's legal and what's not legal, but also the laws give police discretion to contact and to cite, and obviously they're not doing that in a way that's consistent across the city. So walk us through what you see there.
Alan, do you want to take this?
Yeah, sure. So really, it's the inverted L, with the exception of East Colfax and east parts of East Colfax. Most of the citations are being given in communities like Green Valley Ranch, the West Side, and I think it's disingenuous for us to say, oh, we're enforcing here because there's been more fatalities. The reality is if for any of you that have ever tried to cross Federal Boulevard, it is so dangerous, right? And people are not being killed there because they're jaywalking. People are being killed there because it's one of the most dangerous roads in the entire state of Colorado. So to Joel, to answer your question, what I see here is it's the same patterns that we've seen, a disproportionate enforcement of laws in these communities of color and among the unhoused population, I think. So that's what I see when I look at this map. It's funny that you asked that. when we started this conversation, and it came out of kind of a decriminalizing multimodal transportation forum that a lot of people on this call were involved in, but we knew where these citations were going to be before we even pulled the data. We were like, yeah, it's going to be the inverted L, because everything else in Denver is the inverted L. And the data just backed it up.
So these are the top however many locations by frequency of citing for jaywalking.
That's right. These are the places where tickets have been given for jaywalking. Yeah.
Okay. Waiting for additional questions. I'll just ask about where this is going advocacy-wise. So there's sort of one path that the laws remain the laws as they are, but the police are required to give them the lowest priority. And there's another path that is change the laws. You know, don't make things more criminalized than the state requires. And you're kind of pursuing both.
Yeah, I think we're pursuing both in parallel. And we'd love to see something more like Virginia statewide. I don't, as a small group of advocates with a very limited budget and amount of free time, we're not yet prepared to look at something statewide like what Virginia did. But I think at least in Denver, this is a relatively conversation is like, hey, let's just bring our laws in alignment with the state. They don't need to be more strict. And let's also, as you said, look in parallel to try to make this something that at least we can publicly state that DPD should not be focusing time on, because frankly, it's not making our streets safer based on the data.
There's also something we should probably highlight, and that is that the intersections are the most dangerous place to be. As a pedestrian or as a cyclist, that's where you see most of the crashes and the bad interactions. So when someone's crossing mid-block, they're making a rational decision. And so, you know, the same kind of argument with the safety stop where bicyclists were making a rational decision to be safer. We said, hey, let's go ahead and make this a legal thing. I think that's important. And it's also interesting that we had the discussion of the shared streets tonight. We kind of breezed over that point. But one of the, I forget who exactly, but one of the DOTI folks had told us at one point, like the shared streets are basically breaking Denver municipal code. So, you know, that I think they won't say it explicitly, but that was part of their motivation in removing them. So this removes yet another blocker for the shared streets too. So there's a lot of different angles to this one.
I'll add, Joel, I did put a couple links in here. We are in the process of trying to gather stories from community. As a white cis male, I have never been approached. I've jaywalked a ton in my life in Denver and other cities very safely. I've never walked in front of a car right in front of me, but I do have lots of friends that are people of color that have been stopped not only for crossing the street, but for walking down the street, right? So we're encouraging folks to add their stories here. If folks from the community want to do that, it's that first link there. And the second link is if anyone wants to show your support for this, either as an individual or as an organization, you're welcome to do that with that second link as well. We're trying to gather a list of kind of endorsements, if you will.
Thank you. Just call for any questions or thoughts. They're looking for feedback and ideas. If you've seen something that works somewhere else, or you want to add your voice to another aspect of this they haven't thought of, please just raise your hand or write something in the chat. I got a question that occurred to me here. So if we're thinking about the shared streets, it looked like, and I'm not at all familiar with these laws, it looked like the things we're doing with shared streets might fall afoul of a strict reading of the state regulations as well. So is the state change needed for shared streets?
I think for some aspects of shared streets, it's just saying you walk on the side of the road as opposed to right smack down the middle of it. So I think there's an element that shared streets could definitely be designed. And Jacob, Jake, Rob, feel welcome to chime in as well, but I think they could be designed as ways that people could still walk in the street.
I think your example of cannabis was good too, because, you know, we had a law that was maybe more flexible than the state's wide. So we're probably not going to see a shared street on Colfax, which is a state street, but I do not think personally that the state is going to worry about 16th Avenue, to be quite honest. So I think we could loosen our rules there and make a shared street on something like that and not really run afoul of them. Personal opinion, but that's what I think.
We do also have effectively some of the same rules as the shared streets in places like the Boulder Pearl Street Mall, more explicitly than maybe the 16th Street Mall in Denver, but those seem to be okay with the state, needless to say, which I think as a municipality, we can make our own call on that one and be, okay from the state law issue. I think there's definitely improvements to the state law language that this group might make, but I don't see that as a particular challenge.
Okay, we've got two things. Wendy with a comment on terminology, and then Lucia with her hand up. Wendy.
Hi, yeah, just a comment that I really have always despised the shared streets term. I feel like it really implies that every other street is not a shared street, and that's not the case. You all have a right to the street, whether we're on a bike, whether we're in a wheelchair, if we're walking. And it's really frustrating to hear that all the time. It feels like it just keeps hammering into drivers that not all streets are made for everyone. So I just suggest a name change. Jack suggested slow streets, which makes a ton more sense. Just a suggestion. Thanks.
Thank you. Lucia.
It's actually Adrian Brown. I just wanted to throw into the mix the societal angle of this. A lot of years ago, I lived in Vancouver, British Columbia, and I don't know what the state of the law was there, but the state of the practice was that pedestrians had absolute right-of-way. At any point on any street, if you turned and looked like you were going to step across the street, the traffic stopped. And this was a very refreshing, but also very safe because people were looking out for pedestrians and not expecting them on sidewalks and expecting to be hammered if they took the opposite view and ran over somebody, or even, essentially threatened to run over them. And there was great acceptance and pride by the driving community of protecting the pedestrians. I lived in Vancouver for 5 years. 1.5 of those years, we didn't even own a car. They have excellent bus systems and so forth. And the whole system was predicated on the assumption that there was a pecking order as to the use of the streets, that pecking order headed by pedestrians and then going down the pecking order to buses and so forth. And the last people on the pecking order were vehicle owners and operators, and they were proud to be last and proud to be accommodating. It's a social issue here as much as I think a safety or a road issue.
Yeah, I would agree with you completely there and note that we're dealing with the repercussions of America prioritizing the automobile industry and the segregation of highways in our communities. So now we're dealing with the repercussions of jaywalking, disproportionately impacting marginalized folks, but the history of jaywalking was simply to prioritize vehicles and prioritize human behavior over infrastructure investments in America. So yeah.
I would definitely not disagree, but agree. I will say with some of our discussions, we've sat down in front of a number of council people, and quite frankly, I have been shocked by some of their piss poor responses. There's been a lot of support, don't get me wrong, but some of them have had some very victim blaming kind of statements, and they're in the same sort of car brain mindset as everybody else. So I think you're right. This doesn't aim to change society, but I think it's a good first step. We have gotten support from people who even have some pretty bad responses. So this is a great first step, and hopefully we get to that Vancouver model someday. But I think we're on the right course here.
Great. Mark, do you want to finish it up?
Yeah, sure. Couple of thoughts. I'm actually, honestly, I did not realize that the Denver code basically said that you could not walk in the street when there is a sidewalk, because I live in a neighborhood that has attached sidewalks for the most part, and then we've probably got about 15, 20% of my neighborhood is missing sidewalks. And so our neighborhood, being a fairly affluent white neighborhood, people just walk in the street. People walk side by side. Anyone with a stroller walks in the street. We all just walk in the street. And I think my neighbors would be flabbergasted to learn that they are technically breaking the law there. And along those lines, I think leaning into how dumb that is, especially on residential streets, is a key here. I also think that you're sort of putting two and two together about the fact that that law specifically is probably one of the things that DOTI is running up against when they want to create shared streets is, I think, something that you guys should explicitly highlight. Maybe even get one of the city council attorneys to look into this and find out, hey, is this one of the reasons why DOTI has had to back off of this, even if they don't want to publicly say it? Because that's exactly the kind of stupid law that and hey, we had these wonderful shared streets. People want these back, but we can't do it because of this. We need to change this. So I would lean into that aspect of it. So that's all I got.
Mark, do you mind asking what part of town that you're in?
Yeah, University Park.
Which was not on the map for places that was being enforced in either.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Well, thank you very much. This sounds like a great move for advocates. We're a little bit over time, but Leslie, do you have something brief?
I do. If you don't mind, if I could make an announcement on our shared street party that we're having. Denver Streets Partnership and the Federal Boulevard Business Improvement District next Friday, July 22nd. We're having a party to showcase our coming shared street that will go under construction in 2023. And to just reiterate what the earlier speaker was saying, this was a very long process. I think we started advocating for bond money in 2016 and will finally go under construction in 2023. But this is a celebration of what it took for us to get there. And neighborhood folks like Gosha Kung, Marshall Vanderberg, who started what was in essence a party on a historically commercial street off Federal. And so this has been literally an 11-year process to get a shared street, but I hope you all join us. We're gonna have music, we're gonna have food, obviously. And I think it's just a beautiful way to celebrate how long it took our community to get here to a shared street. And to Lucia's point, shared street is not the right word. When we say that around the community, nobody knows exactly what that means. They think of Sharrow streets, which is not what this is. We're literally changing the path of the street and we're adding a chicane. Nobody knows what a chicane is either. But DOTI will be there at the party with drawings. We're in the 90% design phase. So we would love any feedback and just any celebration of what it took for many people in the community to get here over 11 years. So that's it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Thank you. And tell us again the date, time, and what intersection to meet at.
It is Friday, July 22nd, which is a week from tomorrow. The time is 5 to 9 p.m. and it's West 25th Avenue between Federal Boulevard and Elliott. That's going to be the block that gets the chicane, and we're narrowing the street. We're concentrating the parking to one end. We're essentially reclaiming the asphalt for people, and it won't be asphalt. It'll be a different material, including supposedly some sandstone from Curtis Mestizo Park being reused. So thank you again for letting me drop in with that announcement.
Thank you so much. We will stay in touch with the organizers here as the effort comes into focus and there's moments to have an influence. There's right now, talk to your city council members. There were some links in the chat to use, but when there's a call for something specific that an organization can take a position on, they'll let us know. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Sorry, we've gone over slightly, but we try to have a packed meeting with a lot of topics and definitely did that this month. We meet the second Thursday of every other month. So July, August, September, we'll be meeting the second Thursday of September. And please let me know if you have topics you want to bring. Thank you to Jacob. Thank you to Rob. Thank you to Jake. And we'll see you all in 2 months. Thanks, everyone.